The morning after Margaret's funeral, I washed her teacup. I don't know why that particular task undid me the way it did. I'd managed to get through 3 days of neighbors dropping off casseroles, 2 days of phone calls from people I hadn't spoken to in years, and one long afternoon at the solicitor's office reviewing documents I couldn't bring myself to read properly. But standing at the kitchen sink in our house in Blackwood, holding that blue ceramic cup with the small chip on the handle that she'd always meant to throw away and never did, I felt the full weight of 62 years of living collapse onto my chest at once. Margaret had been gone for 5 weeks. Ovarian cancer. Aggressive and unannounced. The kind that introduces itself only when it's already made itself at home. She'd been diagnosed in January and gone by the 3rd week of March, 11 weeks from first scan to funeral. Our son Thomas had flown in from Perth. Our daughter-in-law Janet had been extraordinary. I'd stood at the graveside in the Adelaide Hills Cemetery and said all the things that needed to be said, and then I'd come home and stood at the kitchen sink every morning since, trying to figure out what a retired mechanical engineer does with 30 years of marriage and nowhere left to put them. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. It wasn't delivered by hand the way things are in films. It came in the regular post, in a plain white envelope from the Commonwealth Bank, addressed to the estate of Margaret Elaine Voss. I almost set it aside with the stack of condolence cards I hadn't finished reading. Something made me open it instead. It was an automated notice. A direct debit that had been processing for 19 years had failed to clear because it was linked to an account in Margaret's name alone at a branch on King William Street in the city, had been frozen upon notification of her death. The direct debit was for rent. A property at 14 Hillside Crescent, Gawler East. Monthly. $780. I sat down at the kitchen table and read the letter 4 times. In 30 years of marriage, I had never heard of a property at 14 Hillside Crescent, Gawler East. I had never heard of a bank account at a King William Street branch. The amount, $780 a month, multiplied out over 19 years, was not a small sum. Margaret had been meticulous about our shared finances. She was the one who did our tax returns, managed our superannuation, reminded me when the car registration was due. We had 2 joint accounts and 1 joint term deposit that we reviewed every 6 months over dinner at the kitchen table. She had always said that financial transparency was the foundation of a strong marriage. I put the letter on the table and stared at it for a long time. Then I drove to Gawler East. The drive north from Blackwood takes just over an hour. I'd done it maybe twice in my life. Once for a colleague's retirement party in the mid-90s, and once when I took Thomas to a footy camp up that way when he was about 12. It's not a part of Adelaide I knew well. Gawler sits at the edge of the city's reach, the kind of town that's always been on the verge of being absorbed into the suburban sprawl without quite surrendering its own identity. Hillside Crescent was a quiet residential street of modest fibro-cement homes with well-kept front gardens. Number 14 had a small lemon tree in the front yard and a trellis of jasmine climbing the front fence that must have been beautiful in spring. The curtains were drawn. A blue wheelie bin sat at the curb that no one had brought in. I sat in my car across the street for 10 minutes before I got out. I don't know what I expected to find. An empty house, most likely. Evidence of some investment property Margaret had purchased independently, for reasons I was apparently never supposed to understand. A sensible financial decision she'd made without telling me. What I did not expect was a light on behind the curtains. I crossed the street and knocked on the door. The woman who opened it was perhaps 80 years old. She was small and thin, with white hair cut short, and eyes the exact same shade of gray-green as Margaret's. She was wearing a pale pink cardigan over a floral nightgown, even though it was 11:30 in the morning. She looked at me with an expression of polite uncertainty, the expression of someone who can't quite place a familiar face. "Can I help you?" she said. Her voice was soft and slightly hesitant. There was something in it I couldn't immediately name. A fragility, A careful quality, like someone who had learned to speak gently because words had once been difficult. "I'm sorry to disturb you," I said. "My name is Graham Voss. I think you might have known my wife." "Margaret." The woman's face changed. Something moved through it like weather moving across open ground. Her hand tightened on the doorframe. "Margaret," she said. It wasn't a question. It was the sound of a name someone had been holding in their mouth for a very long time. "You'd better come inside," she said. "I'm Dorothy. I'm Margaret's mother." I stood in the narrow hallway of that small Gawler house and felt the floor shift beneath me. Dorothy made tea with the careful efficiency of someone who found comfort in the routine of it. The kitchen was clean and simply furnished. A ceramic rooster sat on the windowsill. A wall calendar from last year, with some dates circled in red pen and a handwriting I recognized immediately as Margaret's. A small framed photograph on the fridge, slightly faded, of a young woman I didn't recognize holding a baby. When I looked more carefully at the young woman, I recognized the shape of her jaw. "She visits on Wednesdays," Dorothy said, setting a cup in front of me. "Usually around lunch. She rings first." She spoke in the present tense. I felt a cold understanding settle through me. "Dorothy," I said carefully. "When did you last speak to Margaret?" She thought about it. "She rang on the second Wednesday of March. Said she had a doctor's appointment and might be a little late. She never came." Dorothy looked at her hands. "I rang the number she gave me, but it went to voicemail. I thought perhaps she was unwell. She didn't know." In 5 weeks, no one had told her. Margaret had died on the 17th of March, and her mother had been sitting in this house in Gawler East, waiting for a Wednesday phone call that was never going to come. I thought about how to say it. I have always been a practical man, not a cruel one, but there is no gentle architecture for news like this. I said it plainly and quietly, and I watched Dorothy's face as she received it. And it was one of the hardest things I have done in 62 years of living. She didn't cry immediately. She held very still, the way someone holds still when they are trying not to be broken by something. And then she said, very quietly, "I knew something was wrong." She never misses Wednesdays. We sat together in Dorothy's kitchen for over an hour. She answered my questions slowly and carefully, as though she understood that I was trying to assemble a picture from pieces I'd never been given. As she talked, the picture became clearer and more painful with every detail. Dorothy had been diagnosed with a severe depressive disorder and psychosis in her early 40s. Margaret would have been about 12. The marriage to Margaret's father, a man named Raymond Buckley, had not survived it. Raymond had remarried quickly. Margaret and her younger brother had lived with their father and stepmother. Dorothy had been hospitalized twice, then stabilized on medication, then largely invisible to a family that had already reorganized itself around her absence. Margaret had tracked her down at the age of 23, not long after we began dating. She had never told anyone. Not her father, not her brother, not me. She was ashamed, Dorothy said. She said it without bitterness, the way someone states a fact they've had decades to make peace with. Of me. Of what I'd been. When she was a girl, the other children knew. It wasn't people weren't kind about it back then. She wrapped both hands around her teacup, but she never abandoned me. She came back, and she never abandoned me. Whatever else she was never cruel. I thought about the Margaret I had known for 30 years. Capable, organized, warm in practical ways. The woman who always remembered birthdays and sent proper thank you notes and kept the pantry stocked with things people might need. The woman who, when I'd once mentioned that mental illness seemed to be talked about more than it used to be, had said simply, "Good. It should be," and changed the subject. Did she ever mention telling me? I asked. Dorothy was quiet for a moment. She talked about it often in the early years. She wanted to. She said you were the kind of man who would understand. But she'd already been keeping it from you. She said the longer it went on, the more impossible it became to find the words. She looked at me. She was afraid you would think less of her for it, for hiding it. Less of her. As though knowing that her mother had lived with a serious illness was something that would diminish the woman I'd spent 30 years building a life with. As though I would have been anything other than what? Sad for her. Sad that she'd carried this alone for so long. She was wrong about that, I said. I know, Dorothy said gently. I think she knew too. In the end, I drove home to Blackwood in the late afternoon with the city traffic building around me, and I thought about the Wednesday phone calls Margaret had made from the back garden, saying she was checking in with old friends, about the day trips she'd taken a few times a year, always with a vague explanation about visiting a university colleague or attending a committee meeting for a charity I'd never been able to name precisely, about the look on her face when she came home from those trips, quieter than usual, carrying something I'd always attributed to tiredness. She hadn't been tired. She'd been carrying the weight of a divided life, and I hadn't asked clearly enough to help her set it down. That night I sat at the kitchen table with a notepad and wrote down every question I could think of. Then I rang Thomas. He didn't know. His voice, when I explained what I'd found, went through the same progression mine had. Disbelief, recalculation, something like grief for a version of his mother he hadn't known existed. He was quiet for a long time, and then he said, "What do you need, Dad?" "I need to know if there's anything else I don't know," I said. "And then I need to figure out what happens to Dorothy." Margaret had, it emerged over the following days, been extraordinarily careful. The bank account in her name alone had been opened 19 years earlier, the same year Dorothy moved to the Gawler house. Margaret had been making regular payments from it for years: rent, utilities, a weekly grocery delivery, the cost of Dorothy's prescriptions and psychiatrist appointments. She had kept meticulous records of everything in a spreadsheet on her personal laptop, which Thomas helped me access. The spreadsheet went back 12 years and was color-coded. Column after column of expenses, all tracked and balanced. A financial record of a secret kept with the same quiet competence Margaret had brought to everything. There was also a folder. I found it inside a shoebox at the back of her wardrobe, tucked behind a stack of old birthday cards. Manila folder, unsealed. My name, written on the front in her handwriting. I sat on the edge of our bed for a long time before I opened it. Inside were 4 letters. Each one dated, each one addressed to me, each one in the handwriting I'd read in Christmas cards and shopping lists, and 30 years of small notes left on the kitchen bench. The first letter was dated 11 years ago. The second, 7 years ago. The third, 2 years ago. The fourth had been written in late January of this year, less than 3 weeks after her diagnosis. I read them in order. Sitting on the bed in the fading afternoon light, the first letter was the longest. It began, "Graham, I've been trying to work out how to tell you this properly for 9 years, and I've decided that writing it down first might help me find the right words." She explained everything: her mother's illness, her father's departure, the years of shame that had calcified into silence before she'd even met me, the moment in her 20s when she'd found Dorothy again and understood that she could not, and would not, abandon her a second time. The first year of our marriage, when she'd come close to telling me 4 separate times and lost her nerve on each occasion. The way time had made it worse rather than better. Each passing year, adding another layer of silence she'd have to dismantle to reach the truth. "I keep thinking there will be a right moment," she wrote. "But I understand now that I've been waiting for the right moment instead of creating it, and that's cowardice dressed up as patience. I'm sorry for that. You are a good man, and you deserved better than this from me." The second letter was shorter. It described a conversation she'd had with Dorothy about possibly telling me the truth. Dorothy had encouraged her. Margaret had started the letter. then set it aside, then begun again 3 months later, and ended with, "I don't know how to face the look on your face when you realize I've kept this from you for 18 years. I think I could bear your anger more easily than your disappointment. I've always known which one would break me." The third letter was the one that stayed with me longest. Written 2 years ago, on what I recognized as the evening after our younger nephew's wedding, a day I remembered as quietly happy. We'd danced at the reception. We'd driven home through the hills with the windows down. "Today reminded me why I married you," she'd written. "You danced with everyone who needed a partner. You made the teenagers laugh at the table. You drove home with the windows down even though you knew I'd complain about my hair, because you know I secretly love it. I thought about telling you tonight. I almost did. Twice. But you were so happy. And I was so happy. And I couldn't bear to take that away from either of us with 30-year-old news. Maybe next week. Maybe I'll tell you next week. I keep saying that. I've been saying that for 20 years. I'm sorry, Graham. I'm genuinely sorry. You have deserved the truth since before I even knew how to give it to you properly." The fourth letter was brief. Her handwriting was slightly unsteady, and she'd used the good fountain pen she saved for important documents. "Graham," it said, "if I don't get the chance to say this in person, and I'm beginning to understand that I might not, I need you to know 3 things. First, my mother's name is Dorothy Buckley, and she lives at 14 Hillside Crescent, Gawler East. She is 79 years old, and she is alone. Please don't let her stay alone for long. Second, I am sorry. I know that word doesn't cover the distance, but I mean it completely. I was afraid for so long that I forgot how to stop being afraid, and by the time I remembered, I'd run out of time. I should have trusted you from the beginning. I have always known, even when I was most afraid, that you were exactly the kind of man who could hold this gently. Third, and most important, I have loved you for 30 years without reservation and without performance. Whatever else I kept from you, I want you to know that the love was entirely real. Every bit of it. Yours, always. Margaret. I sat with that letter for a very long time. The following Saturday morning, I drove back to Gawler East with 2 things. A box of the almond biscuits Dorothy had mentioned Margaret always brought on Wednesdays, and a decision I'd made somewhere between the kitchen sink and the end of the driveway. Dorothy answered the door in the same pale pink cardigan. Her face, when she saw me, shifted into something careful and uncertain. "I thought perhaps you wouldn't come back," she said. "I said I would." I said, "I keep my word. Can I come in?" We sat at the kitchen table again, and I put the biscuits on the table and told her what I'd found in the shoebox. I read her the 4th letter, the one that mentioned her name. She listened without interrupting, her hands folded on the table in front of her, and when I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "She kept saying she was going to tell you." I always believed her. "She meant to," I said. "She was just scared." "She was always scared of the wrong things," Dorothy said, and there was enormous tenderness in it. The kind of tenderness that doesn't need to be angry to be honest. "I'd like to help," I said carefully. "With the practical things. With making sure the rent gets paid, the groceries come, the appointments happen. Not because of obligation, because she asked me to. In the only way she knew how to ask, which was to leave me your address, and trust that I'd do the right thing with it." Dorothy looked at me for a long moment. In her eyes, I could see the effort of calculating trust, the particular arithmetic of someone who has learned that dependence is a risk. "You don't have to," she said. "I know that," I said. "That's why I want to." Over the following weeks, I drove to Gawler every Wednesday. I learned the routine Margaret had established, the grocery delivery that arrived on Thursdays, the psychiatrist appointment on the first Monday of each month, the way Dorothy preferred her tea with 1 sugar and a little extra milk, the particular television program she watched on Friday evenings that she'd been following for 6 years. I learned that she liked to sit in the garden in the morning, when it was fine, that she kept a sketchbook full of careful pencil drawings that she'd never shown anyone, that her memory for faces and names from decades ago was extraordinary, even when more recent things sometimes slipped, I told Thomas after the 3rd visit. His response surprised me. "Can I come next time?" he asked. "I'd like to meet her." He came on the 4th Wednesday, driving up from his parents-in-law's place in Salisbury, where he was staying while he figured out whether to transfer back to Adelaide permanently. He and Dorothy got on with the immediate ease of people who share a reference point that matters. She showed him the sketchbook. He asked careful, interested questions. When we drove away that afternoon, Thomas was quiet for most of the trip. And then he said, "She's lovely, Dad. Mum must have been so lonely carrying all of this alone." "I think she was," I said. "I think that's what secrets do to you. Eventually. Do you forgive her?" The question had been sitting in my chest for weeks, rotating slowly, waiting for me to look directly at it. I'd been angry quietly, privately angry, in a way that had nothing to do with Dorothy and everything to do with 30 years of a marriage I'd believed I understood completely. I'd sat with the anger in the evenings and tried to be fair to it without being consumed by it. "I'm working on it," I told Thomas. "I'm getting there." He nodded. He didn't push. In the 8th week, Dorothy asked me something I hadn't expected. We were sitting in the garden, the lemon tree dropping small yellow fruit onto the grass around us, and she turned to me with the directness she'd developed over the years of learning to say things clearly rather than circling them. "Do you think she was happy?" Dorothy asked. "With you?" "On balance." I thought about that carefully. About 30 years of dinners and arguments and Sunday mornings and long drives through the hills, and the specific quality of Margaret's laughter when something genuinely caught her off guard. About the letter written after our nephew's wedding, about the woman who kept almond biscuits in her bag for Wednesday, visits and color-coded spreadsheets in her shoebox, and good intentions she ran out of time to deliver. "On balance," I said, "I think she was. I think she was genuinely happy with most of it. I think she was genuinely sad about the part she kept hidden, and I think those two things were always going to have to exist at the same time. Because that's how it goes when you love someone and keep something from them. Neither one cancels the other out." Dorothy nodded slowly. "She said you were wise," she said. "She said you'd be all right in the end." "Did she?" I said. "Many times," Dorothy said. "Many, many times." I went home and I called the estate agent who'd been valuing the Blackwood house. I told him I'd decided to keep it for now, that I wasn't ready to leave yet, but that I was thinking about what came next. He said that was entirely sensible. I hung up the phone and sat at the kitchen table, where Margaret had done our tax returns every July for 3 decades. And I thought about the difference between the life you plan and the life that actually happens. At Christmas, Thomas and Janet came up from Perth with the grandchildren, Clara and James. We had lunch in the Blackwood garden, and in the afternoon, I drove them all to Gawler to introduce Dorothy properly. Janet, who is a nurse and has the particular directness of someone who has seen enough of the world to not be precious about it, sat with Dorothy for an hour and came away saying, "She's sharp as a tack, and she's been too isolated for too long. She needs more company." She was right. And we all knew it. Dorothy had her routines and her stability and her psychiatrist and her pencil drawings, but what she didn't have was the regular presence of people who knew who she was and chose to be there anyway. Margaret had been those people. Concentrated down to one, every Wednesday for 19 years. We talked about it together. It wasn't a difficult conversation. Thomas said that if he did transfer back to Adelaide, which was looking increasingly likely, he and Janet would be glad to be regular visitors. Janet said she could connect Dorothy with a couple of social programs at the community health center that might be good for her. I said I'd keep the Wednesdays going for as long as Dorothy wanted them. Dorothy, when we put it to her, was quiet for a moment. In the particular way she went quiet when something mattered. Then she said, Margaret worried about what would happen to me when she was gone. She used to say it was the thing she lost sleep over most. I'd like to be able to think that she'd know it worked out properly. It worked out properly, I said. On the drive home that evening, with Clara asleep across the back seat and James asking Thomas increasingly detailed questions about how car engines worked, I looked out at the hills, turning purple in the last light, and I let myself feel something I hadn't been sure I'd get to feel for a while. Not happiness exactly, not yet. Something quieter. The particular peace of a man who has been through the difficult stretch and can see, if he looks carefully, that the ground ahead is manageable. Margaret had kept a secret from me for 30 years. She'd done it out of shame and fear and the accumulated inertia of one honest conversation deferred too many times. She'd intended to tell me, had written the words down 4 separate times without ever saying them aloud, and had died, with the intention still intact and the words still unspoken. And what her secret had given me, in the end, was a woman of 80 who drew careful pencil sketches of the lemon tree in her garden and had Margaret's eyes and made tea with 1 sugar and a little extra milk, and who had spent 5 weeks sitting in a house in Gawler East, faithfully waiting for a Wednesday phone call she hadn't understood would never come. I don't know if that's justice or grief or just the way that life, when you follow it honestly to its end, tends to offer you something true in exchange for the comfortable version you thought you had. I think sometimes about what I might have said if Margaret had told me 30 years ago, on our second date perhaps, in the small restaurant on Hutt Street where we'd sat for 3 hours, talking about everything and nothing, or in the first year of our marriage, on one of those Sunday mornings when the city was quiet and there was nothing we had to be doing. I think I would have said, I'm glad you told me. I'm glad she has someone. I'm glad she has you. And then, if I was the man I hope I was even then, you don't have to carry this alone anymore. That's what I would have said. That's what she never believed I would say. The thing about secrets kept out of love is that they are still secrets. The protection they offer is real, but so is the damage. You cannot keep a person safe by keeping them ignorant of who you are. Love without truth is a house built on good intentions alone. And good intentions, however genuine, are not foundations. Margaret was a good woman who made a frightened choice, young, and then protected that choice. For so long it became a wall between us that neither of us could see properly. I loved her. I forgave her. Those 2 things are both entirely true and will remain so. But I also think about Dorothy at her kitchen table every Wednesday morning, setting out 2 cups because her daughter was coming, and I think, tell the people who love you the true things. Tell them while there is still time, not because confession is easy or because honesty is painless, but because the people who love you properly, the ones actually worth the telling, will hold it gently. They will say, I'm glad you told me. You don't have to carry this alone anymore. That is what love is for. Not to receive only what is easy and comfortable and without complication. Love, the real kind, is for carrying the weight together. Give it the chance to do that. Give the people who love you the chance to be what they are capable of being. You might be surprised what they can hold.